There we go.
Hello and welcome to another session of storytelling here at the Grafton Inn in Grafton, Vermont. Unique for celebrating this year its 220th anniversary. One of the very few inns in America still operating over that length of time in its original building, on its original site. Quite a feat. And it's a great honor for me to be here to share the occasion with you. As many of you may know, I worked here at the inn for over 30 years. It was my career and one that I am most pleased to reflect on. And reflection is the word to describe the moment, because what I'm going to do today is just tell you a few stories, though they're not fully developed as stories as one would think of them, but they were things that happened to me down my years at the inn that were remarkable in some way. I hope you will find them as remarkable as I did. The first few little tales could probably be best grouped under the title of The Dutch Connection. And just as a very, very brief explanation, before I ever came to work at the inn, in fact it was in a period right after I got back from Vietnam, my wife and I were then married at that point, and we just headed off into the world to completely change our perspective on that turbulent time, and we wound up living for a year in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam as a matter of fact. And the experiences that I had there were so heartwarming and so powerful that I developed a very deep affection for the Dutch and for Dutch culture. As a matter of fact, I undertook to learn their language. It was assisted by a wonderful woman from here in Vermont who was Dutch. When we returned after that year, she gave me brilliant Dutch lessons, and then I was able to continue studying on my own simply by reading literature. But that being said, there were a number of connections that came to pass down the years I worked at the inn with Dutch guests that came here. And I'm going to tell you a couple of those because they are rather extraordinary, I find. The first has to do with a young Dutch musician whose name was Wouter Verschuren. And Wouter is certainly a name that no American is very familiar with unless they're of Dutch heritage. But the reason Wouter came to the inn here was I had in the years when I was teaching music here, concurrent with my work here at the inn, on my days off I served as a music teacher for the Putney School in Putney, Vermont. There was a young woman, a brilliant young woman, who took guitar lessons with me for a semester before she switched her allegiance from the guitar to the recorders. And her name is Sarah Cantor. She is still a brilliant virtuoso. She lives in the Boston area, which is the United States Center for early music of all kinds, but especially Baroque music. And Sarah finished her schooling after she left the Putney School. She went on to study music in a number of places, but finished her master's work in Holland, studying at the Royal Conservatory in The Hague with a woman named Marion van Bruggen. And Sarah and I kept up some contact down the years. She knew I worked here at the inn, and suddenly I got a call from her one year. And she said, "Bill, I've come back to the States this summer with two friends, and one was Wouter Verschuren and his wife-to-be, a woman named Catherine Cox. And she said, we're touring a concert with our trio." And back then I ran a concert series. It went on for probably 12 years here at the inn, where once a month I would present a formal concert. generally in the white church when it was a formal concert. And Sarah was hoping that she could bring her trio here to play at the inn, and I said, I would love that. I'm a huge fan of Baroque music anyway, and to have music here on original instruments or replicas of original instruments was a great treat. As I mentioned, Sarah was a recorder player, Catherine was a harpsichordist, and Wouter played the Baroque bassoon. Well, fine, they came and gave their concert, and we always offered dinner as part of the compensation for an artist playing here. They also got a cash fee, but dinner was part of it. So at dinner, I was able to sit down for a little bit, and Wouter was so gracious in helping me with my Dutch, helping being that he conversed with me continually in Dutch and didn't switch into English. Almost all Dutch people speak excellent English. And it was a big boost for me, and it created a sort of special little bond between Wouter and me. And fine, the concert took place. The trio went back for another year of studies in The Hague. And the summer following that, I got another call from Sarah. Yes, I'd love to have the trio again. The trio came and played a concert in the White Church. It was the same sort of situation. Wouter humoring my passion for his native tongue, and I enjoying the opportunity to practice Dutch. That finished up, and the trio broke up, of course, at that point. Sarah moved back to the Boston area, where she's lived ever since. Although I think perhaps she's moved back to Vermont now, which is where she grew up. And Wouter and Catherine stayed on and made their life in the Netherlands. Well, a few years came to pass, probably 4 or 5 years. And I developed this real desire to go back and visit Amsterdam, to go back and visit Holland. And so we always closed for a certain period in the spring, as I think perhaps they still do here at the inn. And I planned my vacation, my very brief vacation, it was a little less than a week, to take place in the 3rd week of March, which is the lowest ebb of the tourist season in Holland. It's just before the tulip festivals begin, which are tremendously popular, and at the very end of a long and tapered tourist season. So hotel prices are half of what they would have been 2 weeks after my arrival. And everything was empty. I mean, I could walk through the Rijksmuseum and see perhaps 30, 40, 50 people through the entire tour. And I loved that. But as soon as I got into the city for this little vacation, being a musician myself, I rushed over to the great concert hall in Amsterdam. And many of you who are music fans know it as the Concertgebouw, which basically means the concert building. And I rushed over to see what would be the offerings for that week. Well, as it turned out, that very night, the very night of my arrival, one of the foremost Dutch musicians and musicologists named Ton Koopman, who is still could be described as that, he's still foremost, was presenting the Amsterdam Baroque Orchestra at the Concertgebouw, and they were going to perform a recreation that Ton Koopman had made of Bach's St. Luke Passion. Now, Bach never finished the St. Luke Passion, he only finished sketches to it. And Ton Koopman, with his tremendous knowledge of Bach and his style, had undertaken to complete that oratorio, and that was what was being presented. Well, I was beside myself with excitement to learn that, and I went rushing over to the ticket window and asked about tickets available still for that evening, and they sort of laughed at me and said, no, that concert's been sold out for at least 2 months, maybe more. And I stood there, the dismay on my face must have been apparent, and then I started begging. And I said, well, can't you find a way to get me in? I said, there must be season ticket holders that won't show up for their seats. I said, could I wait in the wings, and when they see there's a ticket holder that hasn't showed up, I could take their seat. I'd be willing to pay full price. No, we couldn't do that. You never know when a ticket holder will show up. They might show up halfway through the concert at the intermission, and then what would we do? And I finally I said, well, listen, because I was speaking to them in Dutch, and I said, well, listen, you can hear how passionate I am about Dutch culture. I mean, I've even undertaken to learn your language as best I can. And I said, I just think my life would be so much less if I didn't get to hear this concert. Well, finally, after a certain amount of pleading, these two people got together with a third colleague, put their heads together. Finally, they came back to the ticket window and they said, well, here's the deal. We'll sell you a ticket, but it's for an usher's seat. And where this seat is, you will not be able to see the performers. You can't see the stage. It's way down front near the musician's entrance. And they come out and go up on a spiral. I said, I know how the stage is set up. I said, I've been for concerts here before, and I would be happy to have that seat. I said, because what's important to me, of course, is hearing the music, not necessarily seeing the musicians. They said, okay, you'll have to pay full ticket price. Gladly did. They wrote out a special ticket actually for me. And that night, of course, I arrived in a state of great excitement to see this concert. And went down front, and I was seated, I couldn't have been seated more than 5 feet from the doorway through which the musicians came out, then went past me up the circular staircase and onto the stage. So before the concert, I was just sitting there enjoying looking at the audience and just absorbing the atmosphere of being in Amsterdam once again, in the Concertgebouw, where I'd heard many concerts played. And suddenly the lights dimmed and the musicians began to enter, and I just sat there and I was watching them come through the door, and suddenly I looked up and I said, Wouter? And Wouter looked down at me and he said, Bill, he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I wouldn't miss your debut at the Concertgebouw. And his eyes popped open, and then he had to, of course, continue on his way up onto the stage. And I was joking when I said that to him. I had no idea, but it actually was his debut. He'd been hired as a ringer to play with the Amsterdam Baroque Orchestra, and I believe he is still playing with the orchestra. And of course I got to go backstage afterwards, and he and Catherine and I had a great laugh about this incredible coincidence that I should have arrived, and virtually the first thing I did was run into Wouter, quite by accident. So we had a wonderful reunion, and it made the concert super special for me, and an occasion that I will never forget. The second Dutch story is quite different. It began on an afternoon like any afternoon in the inn, and it wasn't foliage season, but it was high summer, and guests were checking in. And although there were no other guests in the lobby at that moment, this tall man came in with his wife, apparently, up to the front desk and presented himself. And he said, hi, I'm Mr. Jack Kolff, and I have reservations. I said, thank you, sir. And I got out the guest register for him to sign, and I said, I'll get your key for you. And while he was signing in, I happened to mention to him, I said, you know, it's funny, I've never seen the name or heard the name Kolff before. And I said, I'm just wondering. I said, by any chance, is that a Dutch name? And he said, ja zeker meneer, dat is een Nederlandse naam. And when he said that to me in Dutch, I immediately replied to him in Dutch, and we began this little chat, and he was laughing about it. And it turned out his wife, who was an American, also spoke excellent Dutch, and so we had a little conversation there. And as is always the case when I wind up speaking Dutch to a Dutch guest, it does create this special bond. You're sort of a club member. Well, for that reason, when they came out from dinner that night, he asked if I was available. He'd like to speak to me in the lobby, and he said, I was just interested in knowing about how you learned Dutch and why, and that sort of thing. Asked if I had Dutch heritage, and I said, no, not a drop of Dutch blood in my veins, but You know, I'd love to think there was, but it's not the case. And so we got chatting about this and that, and I said, and you're Dutch? I said, now is your wife also Dutch? Because she spoke excellent Dutch. She spoke perfect English, as did he. And he said, no, my wife is from up in the Windsor, Vermont area. That's where she was born and raised. And he said, we met at university and were married after school. And he said, she went on to work while I was in medical school. And he said, I was a cardiac surgeon. And at that point, his wife, Pat, spoke up and she said, well, Jack, tell him about your dad. Well, he said, yeah, he said, my dad he's a pretty famous guy in the world of medicine. He said, my dad is the man that invented the kidney dialysis machine. And I said, wow. You know, this machine, of course, has been responsible for saving countless millions of lives and has sustained life for people whose kidneys can't recover through kidney dialysis. And I said, that's extraordinary. And he said, yeah, he said, next month. He said, actually, Pat and I are going back to the Netherlands where a second museum in Leiden is going to be opened in my father's honor. That was where he had his first residency. And he said they already have a museum up in the city of Groningen in the north of Holland, because that's where he went to medical school. Well, I pried a little more information out of him, which was pretty fascinating. I mean, his dad was named Willem Kolff, Dr. Willem Kolff, and when Willem graduated from medical school, his very first patient upon graduation was a young Dutch farmer who was dying of kidney failure. And back then there was no cure for it. There was nothing they could do to help a person in that. They did what they could to relieve his pain, but it was an agonizing death for that young man, and even probably more agonizing for his family, who saw the extent of his suffering. And it was young Dr. Kolff experiencing that determined the course of his life. And he immediately set about trying to discover a way to help people who are suffering from renal failure. And the very first kidney dialysis machine he invented was a very practical setup using a washing machine, discarded orange juice cans, and sausage casings. And with this small, practical setup, what he was able to do was not save people's lives, but initially what he could do was relieve the pain and suffering the person was going through as they died. And it gave that person a peaceful death and an opportunity for their families to have a peaceful parting with them at that time. So for several years afterwards, and that was just as the war was about to happen in Holland, World War II, and young Dr. Kolff moved down to the hospital in Leiden and continued with his efforts to improve ever the dialysis machine, which he did steadily until, rather than being able to sustain life for just a couple of days beyond what was expected, suddenly he could sustain it for a week, and then with further improvements 2 weeks, then a month, and so forth. Still, when the war ended, his work had received enough publicity that several universities in the United States had sent invitations to him to come and continue his research under their auspices. And since there was no money in Holland at the end of World War II, the country was totally devastated. That was when Dr. Willem Kolff moved with his family to America, and Jack, the man I was meeting with, moved, of course, as a young man of something like 12, 14 years old, moved over with his family. And they remained a Dutch-speaking family, of course, That was always their language at home. But Jack grew up in American schools and very soon sounded like any other American youth, and went on to have his own career as a brilliant cardiac surgeon. Now, that ends one portion of the tale. It was about 2 years later that I was in the barn one night, and by that time we'd started serving food during foliage season in the barn. And a busy, busy night. Every table was filled, and people were still coming in, and I was having to refer them to the garden room for overflow seating and stuff. Well, suddenly a party of 6 walked in, and I thought, oh Lord. And they said, we've come down from Windsor, Vermont, and we would love to have a table. We've journeyed, I'm sorry we didn't make a reservation, but you know, can you help us? And I said, gee, I doubt it, but let me go through the floor, upstairs and down, and I'll see what is likely to turn. So I went upstairs, and I scouted out a couple of tables where the meal was either completed or people were on dessert. And I came down and said, well, there were 2 tables up there that if they turn within the half hour, I can put them together and seat your party of 6, but we're never sure when a table's going to turn. People may linger over coffee, and there's no way we can come and like hurry them out of the establishment just because we want the table. That isn't kosher. So at any rate, they said, well, we'll wait. And I thought, oh geez, they're going to stand here and wait. Well, at that point, an older gentleman in the party came up and began to speak to the fellow I'd been talking to. I heard immediately from his speech that he had a Dutch accent. So I turned and made a comment to him in Dutch. And he immediately turned, and again we had this animated moment of exchanging thoughts in Dutch, and that little bond that developed. And he was saying, well, I was thinking of how could I converse with him? How could I carry on the conversation and keep them entertained, always watching the tables upstairs, hoping they would turn? And I proceeded at this moment to tell them the story of meeting Jack Kolff and the legend of his father. Well, he listened to this for just a minute, and he put his finger up like that, and he went right across the room to where the rest of the party was standing, and he brought over his wife. And he said, you need to talk to this man. And she said, oh, he said, I'll tell the story. He said, it was now several years ago, many years ago actually, he said probably 15 or more. He said that we were at the boat landing up in Windsor where we live, and we were getting ready to go water skiing. So we were in our bathing suits, and there were a number of people around who were going to go boating or other people who were going to go water skiing. And he said suddenly we had been standing around, and this very tall fellow came over, and he said to my wife, he said, I'd like to introduce myself to you. He said, my name is Jack Kolff. And she said, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Kolff. He said, I don't know you at all. He said, well, I'm sure you don't remember it. He said, but that scar I see on your chest, he said, I put that there. She looked at him in amazement. He said, I'm a cardiac surgeon. And he said, I have a particular way in which I open the chest cavity. And he said, I know that I put that scar on you. And they figured out when it happened was in Leiden, Holland, because Jack had gone back to Leiden at one point to school. He stayed there for 4 years, schooling a new generation of young Dutch cardiac surgeons in the most current techniques of heart surgery. And this gentleman that I was talking to in the barn had gone back to visit his family with his wife to Leiden, and his wife had a major heart problem, was rushed to the hospital, and Jack Kolff had performed the surgery on her. And what a wonderful coincidence. I mean, stuff like that happened to me, it seems, all the time at the inn. Wonderful, interesting people and cross currents merging. It was wonderful that way. I did have one other short story to tell you about a much shorter story than the one I just told. Had to do with a woman that came to the front desk. She was a member of a party that had already arrived. They had dinner and were in the barn having drinks. And this was probably about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night that she arrived from New York City and was joining them. The man that was the host of the party was a Dutchman. His name was Maurits Hudig, and came for many years with his lovely wife Kate to this inn. And she was a member joining their party, and they were sort of having a little group of friends that got together for a weekend stay. And she was signing in, and we were chatting. I was telling her that Maurits and his party were in the barn, but she spoke virtually perfect English, but I thought I could detect just a trace of a Dutch accent. And knowing that Maurits was the host of this party, I said to her in Dutch, I said, ma'am, I said, is it possible that you are Dutch in origin? And oh yes, she said, I am, replying in Dutch to me. And we laughed and began this little conversation. She said, I'm very curious. He said, why you would learn to speak Dutch if you're not of Dutch heritage? And I gave her a brief account of that. And she said, well, how do you keep up on it? And I said, well, I read quite a bit in Dutch. I said, that's basically, and I said, I always read out loud to myself when I'm reading a book so that I can keep up on the pronunciation. The pronunciation of many Dutch words confounds people who are learning the language. It's not easy. It is verschrikkelijk. Now that's a Dutch word that means terrible. So the pronunciation they think is terrible. And at any rate, she said, well, what do you read? And I said, well, I read novels, of course, but I am particularly fond of reading history. Oh, she said, who do you read? And I said, well, an author named Geert Mak is my favorite author at the moment. And she said, oh, I know Geert Mak's work. She said, he writes those tremendous long volumes. And I said, yeah, they are very long. She said, they're too long for me. She said, I've never managed to finish one of them. She said, I get 3/4 of the way through and I get distracted and I never finish it. And I said, well, Geert Mak is not my all-time favorite historian. I said, my very favorite historian of all historians I've read is a man named Johan Huizinga, and you've probably heard of him. I said, my favorite book of his is a book titled The Waning of the Middle Ages. And I said, he has the unique ability to take the bones of historic fact and create an entire living fabric out of them. And I said, that is something I admire enormously. She said, I'm so glad you think that highly of him, because Johan Huizinga is my father. And I went, oh my God! You know, and I wanted to touch her. It was like meeting a rock star, you know. I don't know any rock stars, but I met Johan Huizinga's daughter, and that was good enough for me. I mean, she was a very gracious woman, and it certainly has given a special meaning to my reading of his works as the years have gone by. That pretty much concludes the Dutch connection. I might mention that on one of my trips to Holland, one of these short trips in late spring, I made several, that during one trip, I met 6 guests from the inn, from the Grafton Inn, that I knew from the inn. 2 on the flight across the Atlantic, they were on the same plane, and then 2 other couples at 2 separate concerts in Amsterdam during that week. And I thought the chance of doing that, and it was just a remarkable thing where, you know, you'd see somebody across the concert hall and you'd be looking at them and they'd look back at you and you'd kind of look at them and think, no, can't be possible, you know. And then at intermission I'd make a point of finding them, and indeed it was charming. But the world is a small place, and the Grafton Inn is a small place, but the whole world seems to pass through its doors. It's wonderful. Now the last story I'm going to tell you is also a story of coincidence. It doesn't have any Dutch connection to it. And it is, I must say, the most remarkable, if not miraculous, occurrence that I experienced down my years at the inn. And I'm telling it last